We begin with a paradox. Open the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. The text describes a river flowing out of Eden to water the garden, and from there dividing into four headwaters: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, for 2,000 years. Cartographers, explorers, and theologians have tried to draw this map. They failed every single time. Why? Because on our modern planet, these four rivers do not meet. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through modern-day Iraq, but the Pishon and Gihon are nowhere to be found. They are ghost rivers. This geographical impossibility led the Church Fathers to declare Eden a metaphor, a spiritual realm, a non-place. But they were looking at the wrong map. They were looking at a map of the Holocene, our current geological epoch. To find the coordinates of Eden, we don't need a theologian. We need a time machine. We need to strip away 12,000 years of sediment. We need to lower the oceans. We need to look at the Earth not as it is, but as it was during the dying days of the Pleistocene. Because the glitch here isn't in the text, the glitch in the timeline. Tonight, we are not searching for a mythical garden. We are reconstructing a crime scene, a massive ecological crime scene buried under 200 feet of salt water and silt. Welcome to the Glitch Files. The first break in the case didn't come from a shovel. It came from space. In 1993, Dr. Farouk El-Baz and the Center for Remote Sensing at Boston University began analyzing radar images of the Arabian Peninsula. They weren't looking for Eden. They were looking for groundwater. The Saudi desert is one of the driest places on Earth, a vast expanse of sand and heat. But radar waves can penetrate dry sand up to several meters deep. What the satellites revealed was shocking. Beneath the dunes of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait lies the fossilized skeleton of a massive river system. A channel, 5 miles wide in some places, that once flowed from the Hejaz Mountains in the west, cutting across the desert and emptying directly into the head of the Persian Gulf. This river is dead. It has been dry for thousands of years, but its footprint remains. The Bible describes the river Pishon as the one that winds through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Let's overlay the data. The headwaters of this fossil river, now called the Kuwait River, originate in the Cradle of Gold, Ma'ad Dahab, the most productive ancient gold mine in the peninsula. The geology matches. The location matches. The Pishon is real. But to see it flowing, you have to go back to a time when the Arabian desert was a green savanna. And if the Pishon flows into the head of the Persian Gulf, and the Tigris and Euphrates flow into the head of the Persian Gulf, then the convergence point, the location of the garden itself, cannot be on dry land, it must be underwater. This brings us to the Gulf Oasis Theory, proposed by archaeologist Juris Zarins. To understand this, we have to talk about bathymetry, the depth of the ocean floor. The Persian Gulf is an anomaly. It is incredibly shallow. Its average depth is only about 35 to 50 meters. Compare that to the Red Sea, which drops to over 2,000 meters. During the last glacial maximum, about 18,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked up in the polar ice caps that global sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. Do the math. If you lower the sea level by 120 meters, the Persian Gulf drains completely. It ceases to be a sea. So, what was it? It was a valley, a massive, low-lying basin roughly the size of Great Britain. And it wasn't a desert. It was fed by the combined discharge of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karn, and the fossil Pishon River, underground. The region sits atop the Dammam Aquifer, one of the largest freshwater reservoirs in the world. Springs would have bubbled up from the limestone floor, while the rest of the world was dealing with the brutal cold of the Ice Age, or the hyper-aridity of the expanding deserts. This valley was a sanctuary, a refugium, that is the biological term, an isolated pocket where life survives when the surrounding environment becomes hostile. It had fresh water. It had mild temperatures. It had dense vegetation. For the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers wandering the harsh plateaus, stumbling into this valley would have felt like entering a different dimension. No biting winds, no scarcity, fruit growing wild, herds of gazelle and aurochs grazing in the marshlands. They called it Eden, a Sumerian loanword meaning plain or steppe, the garden on the plain. But paradise had an expiration date. Around 14,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The great thaw had begun. This wasn't a linear process, it was violent. It happened in pulses. The most significant of these was Meltwater Pulse 1A. It is hard for the modern mind to comprehend the scale of this event. We worry about sea levels rising 3 millimeters a year. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, sea levels rose by nearly 20 meters in less than 500 years. That is a geological blink of an eye. The ocean began to breach the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow bottleneck that separated the Gulf Valley from the Indian Ocean. Imagine the scene. At the southeastern end of the valley, a waterfall of seawater begins to crash through the strait. The salt water crept up the valley floor. It moved faster than the forests could retreat. First, the marshes turned brackish. The reeds died. The animals moved north. Then, the freshwater springs were contaminated. The fountains of the deep were corrupted. The humans living there were forced to retreat. They moved their camps, a mile this year, 2 miles the next. But the water kept coming. Generations were born and died with the singular knowledge that the world was shrinking, that the water was an enemy that could not be killed. This slow-motion apocalypse is the root of the flood myth. It isn't just in the Bible. It is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is in the Atrahasis. It is in the Hindu texts of Manu. Why is the flood myth universal? Because the event was global. The coastline of the entire planet was being redrawn. But nowhere was the devastation more total than in the Gulf Oasis. Because here, they didn't just lose a coastline, they lost their entire world. The basin filled up like a bathtub. By 6000 BC, the Gulf had reached its current level. The garden was gone. This is where history turns into psychology. Imagine the trauma of that displacement. You are forced out of the lush valley and pushed up into the Zagros Mountains or the dry plains of Mesopotamia. The environment here is hostile. The rain is unpredictable. The sun is scorching. To survive, you cannot just gather fruit. You have to work. You have to invent agriculture. Genesis 3:17-19 captures this transition with chilling accuracy. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food. This is not a metaphysical curse, it is an agricultural reality. Farming is hard. It destroys the body. Skeletal records from the early Neolithic show a sudden spike in arthritis, spinal deformities, and dental decay compared to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They worked harder, died younger, and lived in fear of famine, and as they broke their backs tilling the dry soil of Iraq, they looked south, toward the shimmering water of the Gulf, and told their children about the time before, the time when we didn't have to work, the time when we were innocent, the time before we were cast out. If this theory is true, there should be physical evidence of the migration. We find it in the sudden appearance of the Ubaid culture, around 5500 BC. In southern Mesopotamia, the shoreline of the newly filled Gulf, a sophisticated culture appears out of nowhere. Archaeologists have long been puzzled by the Ubaid period. They didn't seem to evolve from the local northern cultures like the Halaf. They arrived with a fully formed toolkit. They had advanced pottery. They had knowledge of irrigation, and they built boats. Clay models of boats found at Ubaid sites show a design remarkably similar to the marsh boats used in southern Iraq today. Why would a people living in the desert have such a sophisticated maritime tradition? Unless they came from the water. The Ubaid settlements are concentrated along the ancient coastline. It is exactly what you would expect from a refugee population landing on a new shore. But we can go deeper, into the blood. Geneticists trace human migration using haplogroups. For the Middle East, the key marker is haplogroup J, specifically J1 and J2. Current genetic studies suggest that haplogroup J originated in the region of the Zagros Mountains and the Near East around 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. But there is a dispersal event, a massive expansion of this genetic lineage that coincides with the Neolithic relution. The population exploded and moved outward. Could the Gulf Oasis have been the incubator for this haplogroup while the population was concentrated in the refugium? The genetic diversity bottlenecked and defined itself. When the waters rose, the sons of J were pushed out, carrying their DNA and their story north into Mesopotamia, west into the Levant, and east into Iran. We are literally the descendants of these Serviars. The story of Adam is the story of our specific genetic ancestors. The Serviars didn't just wander, they built the Sumerian king list. A stone tablet listing the rulers of history begins with a startling sentence: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. The ruins of Eridu sit on the edge of the desert today. But 6,000 years ago, it was on the coast, and the god of Eridu Enki, the god of water, the god of the Abzu. The Abzu was defined as a deep, freshwater ocean that lay beneath the earth. Why would they worship a freshwater ocean beneath the earth? Because they remembered the aquifers of the Gulf Oasis. They remembered the springs that bubbled up from the ground in the paradise they lost. The temple at Eridu wasn't just a place of worship, it was a memorial. They were trying to recreate the conditions of Eden. They built their ziggurats to reach the sky. But their mythology was obsessed with the water below. While the refugees in the south were building Eridu to mourn the water, another group of Serviares may have fled north, to the highlands, to the headwaters of the rivers that betrayed them. We travel now to southeastern Turkey, to the site that has single-handedly rewritten the history books Gobekli Tepe. Before this discovery, we believed that civilization began with agriculture. We thought first came the farm, then came the food surplus, then came the temple. Gobekli Tepe proves the opposite. First came the temple. The need to worship, or perhaps the need to remember, forced them to invent farming to feed the builders. The site dates back to 9600 BC. Pause on that date. 9600 BC. This is the exact geological moment of Meltwater Pulse 1b. It is the precise window when the sea level rise was accelerating. Is it a coincidence that as the lowlands were being swallowed by the ocean, the Serviares on the high ground began a frantic, impossible construction project? These were hunter-gatherers. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have metal tools, yet they moved limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons. Why? What compelled them to do this? Look at the art. The pillars are not decorated with scenes of daily life. There are no hunting parties, no families. Instead, there are predators, scorpions, spiders, vultures, and snakes. The imagery is dark. It is threatening. It speaks of a world that has turned against humanity. And the serpent. It is everywhere at Gobekli Tepe. In the biblical narrative, the serpent is the antagonist, the deceiver. But in the ancient Near East, the serpent was the symbol of the underground water, of the Abzu, of Enki. Perhaps the serpent wasn't a devil. Perhaps it was a totem of the water god that had flooded their home. Were they carving these pillars to warn future generations? Or were they trying to perform a ritual to lock the earth? To stop the water from rising further, archaeologists have found that the circles at Gobekli Tepe were buried. Deliberately. They didn't just abandon the site. They spent years covering it up with tons of rubble. Why? Maybe the ritual failed. The water kept rising. The magic didn't work. So they buried the temple and moved on, carrying the memory of the failure with them. The memory of a lost battle with nature. The exiles could never return. Genesis 3-24 gives us the final, terrifying image of the expulsion. He placed on the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. For millennia, artists have painted this as an angel holding a fiery weapon. But let's apply the glitch filter. Let's look at the geology of the eastern border of the Gulf Oasis. To the east lie the Zagros Mountains. This is a tectonically active zone. It is a land of earthquakes and fractures. It is also one of the most hydrocarbon-rich regions on the planet. Throughout history, natural gas has escaped from faults in the rock. When this gas meets the air and a spark from lightning or friction it ignites, these are called eternal fires. Baba Gurgur in Iraq. The burning mountain of Yanar Dagh. These fires can burn for thousands of years. Now, imagine the perspective of a refugee standing on the foothills of the Zagros, looking back down toward the valley they just fled. What do they see? They see the ocean, a new, expanding sea covering their homeland. And on the horizon, the sun is rising over the water. The glare of the sun on the flat, moving surface of the ocean is blinding. It turns every way. It flashes and shimmers like polished bronze, and in the foreground, along the fault lines, geysers of fire are erupting from the earth. Fire and water, a flaming sword that turns every way. It wasn't a supernatural guardian. It was a literal barrier. To the south, the ocean that would drown you. To the east, the fires that would burn you. The way to the tree of life was physically shut. The coordinates were locked. So, the garden was lost. The coordinates were submerged. But the story didn't end there. Because the system is looping. We are currently living through the sequel to the Pleistocene melt. We call it climate change, we call it the Anthropocene. But, if you strip away the modern jargon, it is the same old story. The ice is melting. The water is rising. Look at our modern world. Where have we built our greatest cities? New York, Shanghai, London, Mumbai, Tokyo, Miami. We built them on the coastlines. We built them in the oases of the Holocene. We are repeating the exact pattern of the Gulf Oasis civilization. We settled in the lowlands because trade was easy, because the water was there, and now the water is coming back for its debt. The story of Eden is not just a history of what happened to them. It is a simulation of what is happening to us. It is a warning etched into our cultural DNA, screaming across 12,000 years of history. Do not get too comfortable. The coastline is temporary. We think we are the masters of the garden now. We think we can build seawalls. We think we can geo-engineer the atmosphere. But the lesson of the Pishon River, the river that dried up and vanished, is that landscapes change. The lesson of the Gulf is that the ocean has no mercy. There is one final detail in the text that haunts me. Genesis says the tree of life was left in the middle of the garden. It wasn't destroyed, and It wasn't burned, it was just guarded. If the garden is at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, preserved in the anaerobic silt of the ocean floor, what else is down there? We have explored less than 5% of our oceans. The Persian Gulf is politically lateral, shallow, and muddy. It is not a prime target for deep-sea archaeology. But imagine what might be preserved in the submerged caves of the original coastline. Stone tools, bones, perhaps the eye carvings of the first storytellers, or maybe something more significant. Science tells us that the Gulf Oasis was a refugium, a genetic vault where humanity bottlenecked and survived. That means the answers to our origins, the biological Adam and Eve, are literally waiting for us down there. We have spent centuries looking for Eden in the clouds, or in the mountains of Turkey. But maybe the reason we haven't found it, is because we are afraid to get wet. The coordinates are there. 29 degrees north, 48 degrees east. Beneath the waves, waiting for the tide to turn. This has been The Glitch Files. If you want to support our search for the lost timeline, subscribe and tell me in the comments if we drained the Persian Gulf tomorrow. What do you think we would find? A temple, a graveyard, or just mud? Until next time, watch the water.